Welcome to the Cyber Fusion Report, the show where we cut through cybersecurity noise and focus on what actually protects operations, infrastructure, and your business. This podcast is built around one core idea: cyber fusion. A cyber fusion center brings together IT security, operational technology, engineering insight, and human risk into a single coordinated defense strategy. So threats are detected earlier, response is faster, and operation stays running. Each episode, we sit down with security leaders, operators, and industry experts to unpack the real threats facing modern organizations, especially where cyber risk becomes operational risk. No hype, no theory, just practical insight on cyber resilience, operational continuity, and defending critical systems without disruption. If you're responsible for uptime, safety, or business continuity, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Welcome to another episode of the Cyber Fusion Report, where we break down the realities shaping cybersecurity across industrial and critical infrastructure environments. I'm your host, Gary Mullen, and today's conversation is one that really looks at how far we've come, and in some cases, how far we still have to go. We're talking about how OT cyber hygiene has changed over time, from the early compliance-driven years to the global expansion of OT security programs to where we find ourselves today, facing a growing number of organizations that still lack the most basic protections while attackers grow more aggressive and more targeted. And to help unpack this progression, I'm joined by two individuals who have spent decades on the front lines of cybersecurity. Terry McCorkle, CEO and founder of PhishCloud, has led some of the earliest and most advanced red team operations across government, defense, and critical infrastructure environments. His experience spans offensive security, incident response, and OT cyber resilience, and he's been a driving force behind advancing the integration of human IT and OT security into unified cyber defense strategies. Also joining us today is Jonathan Pollet, founder of Red Tiger Security. Jonathan is widely recognized as one of the early pioneers in industrial control system security. He began his career as an electrical engineer, designing PLC and SCADA systems for offshore and onshore facilities before shifting into cybersecurity as industrial systems began connecting to enterprise networks. Over the past 2 decades, he has helped shape many of the standards still guiding OT security today, including contributions to IEC 62443 and NERC CIP, and has led hundreds of security assessments of live industrial control systems around the world. Jonathan has also trained thousands of professionals, advised government and critical infrastructure organizations globally, and continues to be deeply involved in advancing the security of the systems that power modern industry. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. So let's just jump right in. The first question to kind of set the stage for today's conversation: when you look back to the 2010 to 2015 timeframe, what did OT cyber hygiene really look like in practice, especially around NERC CIP work like SVAs and early red team activities?
Man, I think we could probably both take that one on, Jonathan. I- I'll I'll start by saying back in 2010, I was out doing red teaming with the Air Force. Part of that was going into buildings and engineering facilities and looking for the cyber impacts, what we were calling cyber to physical, but those cyber impacts that we could have if an attacker really wanted to go after things like fuel systems and electricity and other things that really drive a lot of the things that we take for granted these days. But what I noticed is when we were looking around those buildings, there wasn't there were a lot of systems I was seeing that if you went and searched, you'd find control specs, things like that, but you didn't find anything for security, nothing for configuration for the security, nothing for design around the security, and no vulnerabilities that had been published. So that's what led to Billy Rios and I doing our 100 Bugs in 100 Days project, and really what led to me meeting Jonathan years ago, uh, working on those things. But it was a green field. There was nothing. Well, there were people that were working on it, but there were no really widely accepted practices. Jonathan, what do you think?
Yeah, so that's great, Terry. We also saw the same thing on in the private sector. We did our first vulnerability assessment of a control system in 2003, and as we progressed up to the 2010 to 2015 timeframe, it was like the Wild Wild West. I mean, we could go to, a power plant here in Houston, maybe managed by CenterPoint Energy, and they could have a really locked down system, nicely defined controls, and have a really pass with a really good passing grade for a vulnerability assessment. Then just go right up the road to Dallas to maybe a TXU facility, and it could be completely bonkers.
Yeah.
Lots of reds, lots of risk. And we saw that in the power industry because that was the first industry that started engaging with us, water, wastewater, power, chemicals with the CFATS movement with DHS. I think during the time frame of 2010 and 2015, because of a lot of regulations that started coming out, the government at first was hands off and they were like, well, look, we'll let you guys swim in the pool without a lifeguard until they saw so many bad practices that they're like, okay, now we need to make some prescriptive, at least minimum, controls for cybersecurity. And so as, we saw from 2010 to 2015, a rapid uh, increase in the maturity of especially power and chemicals, because those two had regulations and standards in place with NERC, SIP, and with CFATS. And so maturity started rising pretty quickly. These companies that were regulated were able to get funding for their projects. That means that their boards now were woken up and said, okay, now we need to do something about this. So we started seeing, the attention that cybersecurity needed flow from the top down. And and so we were engaged very heavily doing a lot of SVAs, security vulnerability assessments to meet the NERC SIP requirements. And we saw that, the rising tide kind of lifted all the boats. And, some people argue that, compliance is not security, being more than NERC SIP. And they'll like to badmouth, regulations. But I will tell you that it did increase the overall maturity of the United States electric grid considerably over those 5 years. Because towards the end, but around 2015, we could go to many different power plants or T&D installations and see they were definitely hitting all the marks. They had the controls in place, and they were doing the right things, at least from a maturity standpoint.
Yeah, I think one additional note, what you're saying is absolutely right. I think that the power industry also has an advantage, and that is there are a ton of labs, government-run labs that focus on energy and hold, divisions of the government that regulate energy and, how that's done. And I think when you get into other areas like manufacturing and even water treatment, a lot of those are so localized. They don't have some of that top cover that we saw, the energy sector have. But you're absolutely right. Is everybody kind of started waking up around that 2010 to 2015 timeframe. And it's interesting to see how differently the industries have progressed if you break them down by manufacturing, transportation, energy, medical, pharma, right? So,
So Jonathan, I know you've done a lot of work in the Middle East, which I find really fascinating. And between 2015 and 2025, we saw kind of a major shift in demand from regions like the Middle East that were starting from almost no formal OT cybersecurity frameworks.
Yes.
What were organizations then asking for, and how did that change the way OT security programs were built?
Yeah, I can definitely answer that. Well, I think that the driving forces in the Middle East was not regulation because they weren't regulated yet, but it was because they were being hit with actual attacks. We saw the very first one that became very famous, the Stuxnet attack in 2010, and we saw the Shamoon attack with Saudi Aramco in 2012. Then we saw the Razgaz attack in Qatar that happened in 2014. And so the Middle East was very unprepared for these types of attacks. They didn't have any harmonized frameworks. There was not any best practices or standards being pushed out by their governments to their critical infrastructure constituencies in those countries. In fact, we were brought in at first to do a lot of consultative work for organizations like ICT Qatar, Cybersecurity Malaysia. These are like the DHS arms of these countries. We helped shape the Qatar framework, cybersecurity framework. We helped shape the Oman SCADA security standard that eventually came out after 2020. So a lot of these countries just waited. In fact, the UAE really didn't publish their framework until 2022 or 2023 when the DOE cybersecurity framework came out. So a lot of the customers that were engaging with us were either the government entities themselves trying to get their hands around what type of guidance should we push out to our critical infrastructure customers, and then some savvy oil and gas companies that saw what was happening to their peers and said, let's not wait for the government. What can we do right now? And they looked to the West and they saw that we already had NERC CIP recognized as law. I think the NIST CSF standard 1 had just been released in 2014, and so we had some nice harmonized control standards. So what we would do is we basically took the ISA 99, IEC 62443, the NERC CIP standards, the API standard around encryption. We took the NIST CSF, we took the NIST 800-53, the NIST 861, I'm sorry, 81 that Keith Stouffer worked on. We took all of these different standards and we put them across a big Excel spreadsheet and then put all the controls going down. And then we would sit down with each country and say, okay, which of these controls make sense for the critical infrastructure in your country? And we did a lot of work during that time frame to educate and build up the awareness and to eventually help create the frameworks that these countries use today. And we ended up doing a lot of security audits. We did all of the security assessments for all the power plants that feed power into Dubai. We did all the OT systems that are in support of the Dubai airport. We did a lot of work in Qatar. In fact, we were the company that got awarded all the OT infrastructure for the FIFA World Cup. So what a lot of people don't know is before FIFA comes into your city as a host city, they impose upon you a set of cybersecurity controls that helps the FIFA understand the risk level that their games are not going to be interrupted. So we spent 2 years in Qatar ahead of 2022, making sure jet fuel deliveries to the airport, making sure all the metro systems was working properly, all the petrol stations, all the people mover systems, all the electric power systems to all the stadiums, all the communications and comm systems were secured. So all those critical infrastructures, we spent a lot of time during that time frame because of the requirements of FIFA they put on the host city. So it's kind of interesting when you see what really shapes cybersecurity and readiness. In some cases, it's regulations. government step in and saying, you got to do this now. In some cases, it's geopolitical things. Yeah, and in some cases, it's, things like the World Cup, coming to your city and all of a sudden, shoot, now you got to get your act together.
It is good not to have to go first, though, huh? For them, they got to learn from the things that everybody else is already working on. So it's nice not to have to recreate the wheel.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, and the other thing that helps shape that too, right, is the success of those attacks. It's kind of like the airplane industry. Real changes only get made after there's been a major accident, right? And they do the investigation and then they make changes, and quite often that happens in security. Let's fast forward to today. And we're seeing many small and mid-tier manufacturers that operate with little to no segmentation or monitoring. They don't have incident response if they can detect it, and no playbooks to operate by. How here we are in 2026. How did we get to this point where there are so many organizations like this that remain exposed, despite the fact that we've been talking about this for many, many years, and there has been a good bit of industry progress.
Yeah, I mean, I can see the shift flipping back to North America now, just in the number and the type of RFPs that we're responding to and the types of customers that are reaching out to us. I think now that, a lot of the larger companies, the larger oil and gas companies, the larger electric power companies, the larger wastewater facilities, the larger manufacturing companies, the larger chemical companies, they've already kind of started doing their due diligence and building out their cyber programs. And I think a lot of that happened when they started rolling up the cyber responsibility underneath the CIO or the CISO and taking away from the old model, which was decentralized. And in fact, we're still seeing that today. We still are working with mid-tier manufacturing companies where, they have a core group that's doing cybersecurity for the IT part of the company. They have a SOC, they have good practices, they're passing audits on the enterprise side. But on the OT side, every plant manager or supervisor kind of just is allowed to kind of make their own decisions around, obsolescence or patching or cyber hygiene. And unfortunately, these supervisors are being told and being motivated. Behavior also follows. What's motivating this behavior? Well, it's the drivers the company is putting in place. These companies are providing bonuses and salary updates and mobility, and they're praising these supervisors for running with lean, low cost operations. Right, so the cheapest that they can run these manufacturing facilities, the better it is for them. Right. So what I've had to do is educate the board and say, look, you're creating the problem because you've given these guys the responsibility for securing their assets. However, they don't understand risk, and they're being told and driven. Their behavior is saying, we're praising you and we're giving you bonuses. You're doing a great job by spending hardly no money. So why would these guys carve out of their O&M budget, to implement firewalls or implement monitoring or do asset inventory? No, they're just going to run the plant the same old way they've been running their plant for the past 20 years. Because these guys are like, well, nothing really happened to us in the past. Why do we need to change anything? So really, it's like, when you do a RACI chart, and that's usually what starts everything, is we start at governance. We're like, okay, do the people that have the responsibility and are calling the shots for cybersecurity actually really own the risk? I mean, if there's an incident that happens at a plant that shuts down the plant, or at worst case causes a safety incident because a robotic arm starts moving around crazily, and there's loss of life or loss of a huge financial impact, Do you think that plant supervisor's head's going to roll? No, they're going to go like, oh, that's an IT thing. I guess our CIO or our CISO didn't secure our network that we use, so they're going to be pointing fingers this way. And then the CISO or the CIO is going to be pointing fingers this way saying, no, we tried to implement these protocols, but you told us operationally that we can't patch those systems. So no one really is got, the accountability for where the buck stops, right? So we've had a lot of good success especially in the manufacturing space, by realigning that risk and responsibility underneath the CISO or the CIO or someone that reports to the board, give them the financial budget to fix things, and also give them metrics on a monthly basis that reports back to the board on, this is our maturity level, this is how bad we are, this is how our expenditures are bringing us up to a higher level of maturity. And even as of this year, we're still working with multi-billion-dollar manufacturing companies that you buy their products at CVS, you buy their products at Walgreens, and they have no segmentation between IT and OT. The infrastructure that's running all their production systems is running on the same, Cisco network that's running their IT environment. If you're lucky, some of the, plant lines might be on a protected VLAN if you're lucky, but most of them just talk directly from IT to OT without a DMZ. We're also starting to see a huge ramp up in cloud adoption across the board, and this mainly manufacturing, but pharma, and in fact, many of the critical infrastructure industries. I'd say maybe power is probably going to be the last to fully embrace cloud, but we're seeing systems that have controllers at the plant floor level, at level 0, level 1 in the Purdue model, talking directly up to an OPC server in the cloud.
Yep.
Crossing all these different, which should be layers of a defense approach, because that's what the OPC companies and the SCADA companies and the system integrators are pushing. They're saying, hey, it's easier for us to support you if you put your OPC server and you put your SCADA infrastructure, your HMIs all up in the cloud, because we can just update the graphics or update the process variables and update the tags in one place, and it propagates to all your plants. So from a business perspective, the OT environment is being pushed up into the IT environment and into the cloud. And there's very little pushback, because the people making those decisions are the project engineers, the OT engineers that are being tasked to maintain these lines and doing these upgrades to these process lines without any integration with cybersecurity. So cybersecurity is oftentimes doesn't even know what's going on the plant floor until we do an audit. A lot of times, they bring us in, we get brought in by internal audit, or get brought in by the IT side to try to peek behind the veil and see what's actually going on in the OT IoT side. And since we speak the language of the OT people and we can do our assessments in a passive way without shutting down operations, we're having a lot of success in able to get these two different groups to communicate. And then once we do a bit of training and awareness, and we start to show why, putting all this stuff in the cloud without the proper defenses in place is unsafe, why having back doors with modems and 3G, 4G, 5G cellular cards directly in the backplane of PLCs for remote support is not okay. We start pointing out all these different things. What we're finding out is it's not just a technology issue, because I think we have plenty of technology today that can solve these problems. It's an awareness issue, and it's a training issue, and it's a governance issue. And I think right now that mid-tier level, people that are operating at around, let's say, $1 to $10 billion of revenue across all critical infrastructure sectors are really being targeted by ransomware gangs, because I think they're not dumb either. They know the landscape, and they know that the bigger players are probably better prepared. They're doing their probing, they're doing their analysis, they're using AI bots to do that for them, and the actual malware itself is getting more sophisticated to where the point where sometimes the malware itself is not even having to phone home to a command and control server anymore, because it's so much aware of its surroundings and can call upon the resources of the workstation that it's landed on, that it can survive off the land, spread, do all of its mission without any phoning home. So it's evading detection. And the funny thing is, they don't even really need to worry about invading detection, because there's no detection systems on the
There's
OT
no
side
detection,
either. So we have
especially
this perfect
east-west.
storm where the malware is getting better, but the cybersecurity capabilities are not there. So that's why I think we're seeing this big push right now in that sector of the market to really raise their level of maturity.
That you really covered that well. I think that you've seen a lot of shift. The other thing is these companies have grown and merged over the years, so you don't necessarily know what you have. To your point about you have the operators, the plant operators, and you talk to a CISO, and the CISO is saying, hey, I have to manage, 15, 20, 100, plants that are a combination of 10 companies we've acquired over the last 4 years, and they have control of that facility. He's like, I have no influence really to tell them what they have to do because they're driven by safety and production, right?
Yeah.
The thing that I keep going back to is there's so much data that's now collectible that when we started this, getting true visibility in a plant was relatively difficult. But it's gotten easier, and we're able to collect the data. We're able to have visibility into the data. So I think it has to be one of these situations. If you try to drive with pure security, a lot of times you're met with hesitancy, right? Like you're in an audit function, they're not always happy you're there. But I think if we can start teaching the industry what their data can actually do for them and how much more efficient they can be if they understand their data and secure they can be if they understand their data, that they need to, probably a lot of them need to start collecting, right? But I think we have an opportunity to teach them, and learn from some of the experience in the past of how to avoid these things. But you're right, there's a cultural issue in a lot of places.
Yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
we've seen from recent breaches, the attackers clearly know where the weak spots are in the OT environment, right? And as you pointed out, Jonathan, that the people running the plant floor have limited or no visibility into where their weak spots are, and lack of detection means no response. Um, what type of ransomware and malware activity are you guys seeing out there that are specifically targeting these organizations that really have no foundational cyber hygiene?
Yeah, well,
Uh,
we're definitely seeing attacks on their MES, manufacturing execution systems, SAP, because those systems, they communicate to the internet, they communicate to their partners, but those systems also communicate downward to the plant floor. And once an adversary gets hold of that MES or SAP system, they can put a stranglehold on a company. There's no more orders coming in. There's no more orders going out. There's no visibility on raw materials. They have to either stop production, or they have to try to run manually, which a lot of these companies can't do anymore.
Mhm.
And we're also seeing malware that is being brought into these systems still on USB sticks. I mean, we were doing an assessment at the end of 2025, and we on our assessment approach, we go machine to machine one at a time. And after we run our tool, our Red Cat tool, we check to make sure that stick's not infected. gather all that information off that machine, and then format our stick and put it in the next machine. So we know each machine is either clean or unclean. And we're still finding infected workstations, SCADA HMI systems, touchscreen panels where you touch and start and stop the machine, riddled with ransomware. We found like over 100 pieces of malware on one machine alone. And then when we pointed it out to the people that were working at this facility, they said, "Oh yeah, we know that machine has some junk on it. Yeah, we always tell people don't put anything into that machine. It has malware on it." Like, well, have you reached out to your IT company and said something about this? And they're like, "Oh no, it still works. We can still push the buttons. It still makes the parts." And
Yeah.
so we saw
That's
that
what
in
it's supposed
Dubai
to
as
do.
well. Some of the power plants we worked in, and also at the Dubai airport, where there's systems that have malware. It's already been compromised. By the time we get there to do our assessment, we point it out. And there's a lot of shrugging, like, well, it still does its job. We're not really worried that much about it. And so I think the education is a big issue. And also, there's a huge disconnect between the people running in the SOC, those people who have invested in a SOC. And so they have security operations centers, they have SOC analysts, they have threat feeds coming in, they have vulnerability feeds coming in. These guys are knowledgeable, watching this going on. But there's a disconnect between that feed of information coming in and then the infrastructure below that they're being tasked to protect. Because if you don't have an up-to-date live asset inventory, how do you even know how to prioritize all of this volume of threat, vulnerability, and exploit feeds coming in? CISA's pumping out a bunch of, vulns, every week. And so if you're a SOC analyst and you're reading through this and like, oh, do we even have a Rockwell Control Logics, this version running in our system? Do we even have a Siemens S7? Where is it running? Do we worry about this firmware or not? So if you don't have a live up-to-date asset inventory that actually can feed upward from all of your plants to your SOC analysts, then you can't really prioritize your day-to-day operations. And then the SOC analysts don't know who to reach out to at the plants because they don't have a cyber champion at every location. And what we try to tell our customers is, we went through this whole wave in safety, right? Every plant you go to in every industry, they care about safety. In fact, there's a person at every single plant, whether it's a refinery or a chemical plant, power plant, manufacturing plant, there is someone designated as the HSE champion. So if any safety incident happens, that's the person at the plant you go to. That's where you report your incident to. That's the person that's the first responder. If there's an incident command that has to be set up. On the cyber side, we don't have that. And so what we try to tell our customers is, why don't you just repeat what you did for safety? You have all these safety posters, you have education around safety, and you have an HSE designated person at every facility. Put some cybersecurity posters up at your plants, start educating your people about cybersecurity, designate a cyber champion at every one of your locations, make sure that they know how to get a hold of the SOC, and the SOC knows how to get a hold of them, because that person is going to definitely know how to contact the PLC person or the SCADA person on the plant floor at that location. So I think the reason I'm so passionate about this is it's a gap that we see at every single one of our assessments. It keeps coming up every single time. And so, and that's why 2 years ago, we took all of our Red Tiger security training and brought it over to Cambios Academy and recorded it all and made it all available on demand so that more people can get educated. And I think that's those old timers like Terry and I are going to be preaching and talking about this for hopefully the next couple of decades. But eventually, we're going to want to retire. We're not going to want to keep doing this. So we need the next generation of people to come up with that same level of awareness and passion and give them some guidance.
Yeah, I think you're hitting a couple of other kind of hidden points here as well. As yeah, a lot of people they're kind of aware of what's going on. There are people within a plant that can look at an HMI and be like, that's kind of funny that it's doing that. And most people look at it have no idea. but there's that foundational knowledge of how things should operate, how they actually do operate, and that's usually completely different than how it was spec'd, right? There's how it was intended to operate and how it actually operates. But a lot of that knowledge is, they're going to be retiring. And so, there's going to be a workforce problem and all of those things. But I think one of the keys here is now, to your point, people are being told if you think something from a cybersecurity perspective is wrong, or if you think you may have been compromised, here's how you contact IT, right? Here's how you contact the security team, um, reporting those sort of things. In the OT world, that looks a little different. And many organizations, they can't tell the difference between an operational technology issue, something's malfunctioning, versus a cybersecurity event where something is malfunctioning because it was caused, right?
Right.
So I think those are some of the still big gaps that we're trying to work with organizations to solve. Is how do you get more proactive on understanding your devices and get into more of a predictive maintenance where you understand what your plant floor is supposed to look like in a 24/7 operation, right? You know when it's active, what's doing how it's supposed to communicate, so that you can start looking for those outliers like we do in cyber, in most of IT cyber. You're really looking for those outliers, those things that should not have occurred, that are out of place. And I think that's a lot more difficult to detect in the OT world today. So those are some of the big initiatives we're working on as well, because we have to we have to make sure everybody understands this is something everyone's going to have to pay attention to. It's not just one or two people. It's the whole entire company needs to know enough about cybersecurity to make a phone call and say something's strange here.
Yes, absolutely. And, we have a number of ways that our customers are in the critical infrastructure sector, uh, are getting budget for cybersecurity. And this is another thing that comes up quite a bit. Is like, how can I get? There's people in the trenches that know they know that they have problems. They know they want better cybersecurity. They know what they need to do, but they're having some frustration in getting their leadership to buy in on it. And what I've seen is it usually happen in two ways. Either they get hit themselves with ransomware or malware, and they feel real pain because we're a reactive society and not proactive, right? They feel some real pain, and then now they start doing some investigation into, well, how did this happen to us? Or one of their competitors gets hit so hard that they're getting all these new orders coming in from because their competitor can't produce anymore. And now they're asking themselves, well, why are we getting all these extra orders? Oh, it's because they got hit with something. Well, maybe we might be able to get hit with something. So sometimes that happens. And that's how some of our customers are finally waking up and getting some funding. Another way is they'll start with a very light assessment. And there's a reason why they're doing this. And this is for industries that are not regulated. There's no, stick, or there's a carrot maybe, but there's not a stick, right? So what they'll do is they'll start with a very light assessment. And we'll go in, sample a number of their sites, do an assessment, and give them a report. Now, once their board of directors sees a report that has clear risk identified, and those risks are mapped to missing processes, procedures, technology platforms, capabilities, and that risk is mapped to real dollars, and then they choose to do nothing, and a real incident happens, now they can be, sued as a negligent operator. So sometimes, litigation or the fear of litigation can be a way to slowly build traction within a company, if you're listening to this podcast and you're an OT engineer or you're a cyber guy and you're like, man, my company just doesn't get it. One of the things that's been working is, do an assessment, have a third party come in and write a report that gets visibility at the board level.
Yep.
Because once they sign off and they agree, yes, these risks are ours, and they have a risk register, now they are forced to do something about that risk. They have to either acknowledge the risk, they have to remediate the risk, or they have to transfer the risk. They have to do something with that risk. And we found really good success in at least starting with an assessment, educating the leadership at these companies. And then what that does is open up the conversation for investment on the OT side of the company, to bring their maturity level up to where we see it already is on the IT side.
It's kind of like a shock and awe campaign the first time you have a red team assessment come in, and they're like, "We've been having pen tests for years. What is this?" It's not a pen test, right? But
not all
really
gets attention too. When
exactly.
when you get dressed up as a plant worker and work your way through all their defenses and walk directly into all of their facilities, all the I&E cabinets, all of the machines, and have your hand on the emergency stop button that would shut down the entire plant, and it would require weeks for them to restart the plant. Take a picture of yourself doing it. What that does is gets their attention, because before you do a red team, I've had a conversation with plant supervisors, and I'll say, hey, you probably should lock, your I&E cabinets when you're not when someone's not in there doing work. We can't lock them because our contractors going in and out all the time. We really can't do that. But, we have fencing and we have, other cameras on the outside. Well, you really should at least lock the door to the building if someone doesn't need to go into the building. Oh, we don't really need to lock the building because, everyone here kind of knows everybody, and it should be okay. All right. Well, then maybe you should lock the control room, that has the assets that control your plant. And there's control room operators in there all the time, and we can't lock these doors. Okay, well then we should probably put a screen lock on these unmanned areas that you plant. So if someone walks into and it's unlocked, they can't just walk up to the terminal and press a key that there's at least a password to unlock the screen.
Then
Well,
they
we
can't
can't
see
lock
the
the
HMI.
because we have to be able to see alarms. We have to be able to push the buttons, right? So they give excuses to every single thing that we tell them, right? But then we do a red team. And we walk right through all of the defenses. We walk into these doors. We've got our hand on the button, and we see that's why you should lock doors, lock cabinets, have more camera angles on important things, educate your people to question people that they don't know, and probably have locked screens that at least have a password that people know to unlock the screen if they need to. But like every time we talk about common sense controls on the OT side, we're hit with reasons why every common sense control doesn't make sense operationally for them in their mind, until you show them and prove them with a red team or a penetration test. Then they're like, oh, okay, maybe that's
It's
why
waking up.
we should do something.
Yeah. And we could talk about that all day, man.
Well, in the interest of time, let's move to the last question. And Jonathan, you alluded to this a few moments ago, and that is training the next generation of OT people. One of the biggest long-term risks that you highlighted is workforce attrition, with only 1 in 15 OT roles being replaced, and very little formal training to retain knowledge. So how does this loss of OT expertise impact cyber hygiene? And what should organizations be doing right now to hang on to that institutional knowledge they have?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think there needs to be an awakening to the need for cybersecurity awareness on the OT side. I think every company that you look at that's, Fortune 500 company, or you could take an aim at any company out there. They have an IT security budget. They have an IT security awareness budget. Every employee is trained, even if it's just a 1 hour training on, acceptable use policy of a computer. You can't put your USB stick in here. Be careful on what clicks you click on. I mean, you run a company that does phishing campaigns. People are paying for this. They understand the value of training people and testing them for competency on the IT side. And on the OT side, they're not seeing the value, or they don't see the need. And the few customers that we're working with that are starting to get it are basically having to take some of their IT security awareness budget and carve it out and say, okay, this year we're going to do a little bit of OT security awareness. Maybe just give everyone that works around the OT systems a quick 1 hour thing that they can take from their iPad or from their computer on their own time. And we'll start there, at least get some education going. And it gives them the top 10 rules of what to do, what not to do around cybersecurity on plant. And then, we, in the past 2 years working with Cambios Academy, we've developed from that course all the way to deep dive courses and, how to instrument your OT for monitoring and detection, how to build out a SOC, how do you educate incident responders and how to respond to an incident in a plant environment while, you're under fire, but you have to keep the plant running while you're trying to eradicate the threat. That's a huge demand right now. And so we're up to 10 courses now on the platform. In fact, I would encourage you guys, if you're watching the podcast, go to cambiosacademy.com. All the courses are there. You can preview the courses, and you can take some of them directly online. Or get in touch with me. And if you're interested in trying out some of the courses, we can give you an access code to try them. And I think it's great because it's the only way that we're really going to get the knowledge out there to the masses. For years, I was traveling around the world with these Pelican cases, going airport to airport, training people, 15 people, 20 people, 50 people at a time in conference rooms. And yes, that does get the message out there, but there's hundreds of thousands more workers out there that are hard to reach places, maybe offshore platforms, places that, we can't get that message to physically, but on demand, take the training at your leisure. I think that's the future.
Yeah, I think that's really important, getting it consumable by more people. The early training in this subject was, I don't know if you got to go to the ICS cert, red blue team
Yes.
exercises. They
Yes.
had, there were some really good things, but they were only open to very few people, right? SANS started offering courses a while ago, but again, it stops at a certain level, right? And really isn't designed for that practical hands-on approach that you're taking. Is how do you actually implement this in your environment? So that is great. If we'll make sure to include information on how to contact you, and excited to help share there. But I will also say it it's interesting if I look at, like, when I found out about the cyber to physical world, right? I was doing cybersecurity, and I was already really excited about, hacking IT systems. And then all of a sudden there's this thing that's like, I can have a physical impact in the real world. That's just crazy. Like, that cyber to physical. And so that got me really excited about learning control systems and learning about OT. Um, so I'd just say, if there are people that are watching this that the IT side has always been interesting, and you're starting to get a good handle on it. I encourage you to look at the OT side. There's a ton of need for expertise. There's a ton of need for people who understand the subject, and now there's more and more material out there to be able to learn it. But just realize these are the systems that run our world, right? These are the systems that keep our families safe, and it's important that everybody's doing their part to help keep those systems safe. So very exciting subject to learn, and like I said, I'm very passionate about it, like you are, Jonathan. And it is interesting to see you can train IT people on OT, but if if they don't have the interest, it goes straight out the other side,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
They'll a PLC does what again?
Yeah. I mean,
So
I wish they had this training when I was coming out of college
oh
as
my
an
gosh,
electrical engineer because I had very little exposure to PLCs and SCADA systems and control systems. And I even focused my education on in electrical engineering. So a lot of these engineers coming out of college are having to learn on the job by working
right.
next to a systems integrator or working next to a PLC programmer or working next to a SCADA engineer. We have a 1 hour, so we have a 1 day, 8 hour course that just gives you straight brain feed like I now know kung fu. In 1 day it'll give you instrumentation, 4 to 20 feedback, analog inputs, analog outputs, the back plane, the controller, how the controller maps memory out, how controller solves logic, how controllers communicate with different protocols to OPC servers and HMI stations, how those log data to historians and MES systems. It breaks it all down in 1 day. I wish I had that course when I started off my career.
It
And
took me
if you guys are in IT cybersecurity and you want to enhance your career, go
yeah.
take a 1 day course in OT fundamentals and just understand how OT systems work. Then you can apply everything you know about IT security to this field of OT.
It took a long time to get the grasp of it for those of us that were early in the industry, right? And whether you're
Yeah.
coming from the OT side learning security or the security side learning OT, uh, it's
Yes.
it, it's a different language and it's a different challenge, but yeah, absolutely. It's worth learning for sure.
All right, guys, we're going to have to wrap it up there. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I really wish we could have dived deeper into some of these things. You guys have such a great experience foundation. Um, what really stands out from the conversation today is that this is not just a technology problem for organizations. It's a knowledge problem. It's a workforce problem. And for many organizations, it is becoming a business survival problem. Because
Right.
for smaller manufacturers, a successful attack is not just an IT issue. It can stop production, create safety risk, and in some cases, end the business altogether. Terry, Jonathan, I really appreciate both of you sharing your insights and experience today. This has been an incredibly valuable discussion. And to our listeners, if this conversation made you think about your own environment and your own readiness, well, that's exactly the point. Attackers do not wait for organizations to become ready. They look for the ones that are not. Thanks again for joining us for this episode of the Cyber Fusion Report. I'm Gary Mullen, and we'll see you next time. This has been the Cyber Fusion Report podcast. Thanks for joining us. And for more information, please visit www.phishcloud.com or email us at cfc@phishcloud.com. Thanks and have a great day.